I discussed with older brother Lee Van Sau the idea of writing a letter to the U.S. Congress in hopes that Congress would contemplate the American tradition honoring freedom and think about the American youth who had died in Vietnam. The arguments presented in the letter carefully weighed the pros and cons. They were mild-mannered and reasonable. A few days after sending the letter, we learned that the U.S. Congress had objected that the letter was not constructive. And that, by behaving this way, we were interfering in U.S. internal affairs. This was a small matter, but we did gain from it a greater understanding of a large country's self-conceit, and we learned a lesson in international deportment. The choice of Paris as the site of the negotiations was a large victory for us. Perhaps the United States did not realize that even though Vietnam had fought with France, our nation had many close and supportive French friends as well as huge community of patriotic overseas Vietnamese. Paris, which at that time was regarded as the center of Europe and the center of world public opinion, provided us with a favorable location for sending news internationally. We could distribute many important news stories very fast from our delegations in Paris to the rest of the world. Those stories included U.S. expansion of the war to Laos and Cambodia, the U.S. escalation of the war to the north, the U.S. destruction in the north, and the U.S. Army's massacres at My Lai, Sun Mai, and other sites. Within a day, people in many countries would take to the streets to oppose the United States and support Vietnam. These news releases also quickly opposed the heavy-handed actions in the urban centers of South Vietnam. Many Vietnamese from the South who visited Paris told us that it was primarily through the news from other countries that they could understand clearly the situation in the South. In this way, they also came to understand the National Liberation Front and, later, the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Through daily press and television briefings, people could follow closely the battles of Vietnamese regular troops and guerrillas against American Marines. Politicians wanted to watch how the diplomatic arguments played out in Paris between the two warring sides. One side in Paris was allied with communism and socialism, with representatives connected to the North Vietnamese Army and the Liberation Army of South Vietnam. The other side was allied with the Western imperialists led by the United States, with representatives connected to the U.S. Army and the ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Along with the televised scenes of bloody battles and deaths on the battlefield in Vietnam, the maneuvering at the Paris conference involved complicated arguments between the sides as they pursued complex, opposing national and individual interests. Some people tried to use the Soviet Union and China, two of our major allies, to pressure Vietnam. Through quick-minded observation, we could perceive these dynamics from both our adversaries' public actions and their clandestine behavior around the edges of the Paris conference. We were conscious of this situation and of the need for careful discipline in our public statements. Indeed, at times we would say something in public, but then the newspapers would unintentionally or sometimes with direct intention print completely different contents. We constantly had to screen every point and learn from experience. We met many political leaders as well as journalists at various embassy festivities for different countries, national days. Guests would chat about the news. We brothers and sisters were skillful in picking up information, which gave us insight into the issues and the opinions of the various guests. The home of Geneviève Tabouy, a politician and famous French journalist, was a favorite gathering place. Many well-known French political leaders, political activists, retired generals, and eminent journalists came to discuss current affairs. Surely, the guests also included people working in strategic intelligence. I was often invited to Saturday afternoon tea, along with Comrade Nguyen Minh V and lawyer Tran Kong Tuong, both from the DRVN delegation. From the discussions, we understood that the other guests really did want to understand our intentions and to learn where we were headed and when there would be real negotiations. Many people also made the observation common in French political circles that the United States will surely be defeated because, before, the French were wiser in military strategy and tactics but nevertheless met defeat. The French political authorities probably would have been willing to serve as mediators between the United States and the DRVNPRG. The French sought clarity about whether the peace cabinet about to appear in Saigon would have people who were close to France. Individual French people who knew us tried to sound out political issues involving a possible new administration in the South, while they simultaneously tried to sound out the U.S. side. In general, though, the French government was respectful and strove to maintain its neutral role as the host country. During the negotiations, we had many methods to preserve our secrecy and security. One aspect of our success was the political environment in France. We managed to keep all our diplomatic offensives secret to the very last moment, creating the element of surprise that perplexed and disconcerted our opponents. During our nearly 5 years in Paris, in addition to our work directly relating to the negotiations, my comrades and I in the NLF-PRG delegation would visit other countries to attend conferences and solidarity meetings. We took advantage of any invitation from any organization in any country, whether in France, Italy, Africa, or the Americas. Our goal was to maximize the opportunities to explain our position and to mobilize the various strata of people, political parties, and governments. In France, ordinary people were very sympathetic with Vietnam. The French Communist Party had substantial political influence at that time and was a solid support, helping in particular with the solidarity movement by drawing in people from every segment of society. Especially important was the support from a number of world-renowned intellectuals. These included writer and philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, the famous mathematician, Laurent Schwartz, and the venerable lawyer, Joe Norman, the French president of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. These famous people held opposing political views and would often challenge one another, but they agreed on the issue of Vietnam. Each one spoke out in strong support of Vietnam's struggle. Vietnam's indomitable, heroic efforts were a source of inspiration for many French writers and poets. There were those who said, "I wish, when waking up in the morning, to be Vietnamese." The women in the Union of French Women, UFF, were especially constructive. They organized many initiatives in support of Vietnam. These sisters would joke with me. "Ben," they would say, "the French people know more about you than about our French president." The General Confederation of Workers, CGT, was also enthusiastic. "I think we need to help our Vietnamese people understand everything our friends did to help us before and afterwards and especially during the time of the negotiations in Paris. To them we owe a huge debt of gratitude, which we must never forget." Traveling from France to Italy required very little effort. The Italian people's movement supporting Vietnam was very strong, particularly among the youth and trade union members. Many communist activists and representatives from other political parties in the parliament spoke up in support of us, demanding that the United States stop the war. We went many times to Bologna, where the Italian Communist Party had a great deal of influence. I was invited to the parliament to speak about the war. A movement developed to support the health of the Vietnamese by donating blood. Whenever our delegations went to visit, we felt like special guests, with the police escorting us as if we were heads of state. Comrades Trong Tung and Ha Dang still refer to our historic visits to Bologna. For me, the deepest and most emotional memories are from Sweden. The Swedish people, in particular the youth, loved and supported Vietnam. Many youth called themselves Swedish Viet Cong. One time we had just landed at the airport when we saw 2 rows of Swedish youth with blue and red NLF flags. They sang, "Liberate the South," in Swedish to welcome us. Some young friends in the movement came from wealthy families. At first, their parents were angry, but then they noticed that their children became better behaved and more dignified through their political activities. In the end, the parents shifted to supporting us and encouraging their children's work for Vietnam. Here is one special case. Some youth, who called themselves FNL, the letters abbreviating the National Liberation Front in Swedish, had established a Viet Cong liberated area in an abandoned building in the center of the capital. There, the FNL youth set up a printing press and published a newsletter, which they distributed across the various strata of Swedish society. The 2 Swedes whom I especially esteemed were Prime Minister Olof Palme and writer Sarah Lidman. At the beginning of 1970, Prime Minister Palme instructed Mr. Christoph Oberg to invite me to take part in the Swedish Social Democratic Party Congress and to speak about the American war in Vietnam. I was the only foreign representative at the Congress. During that same visit, a huge demonstration had been organized in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, in support of the Vietnamese people's struggle. I joined the Prime Minister in leading that demonstration. Writer Sarah Lidman was famous in Northern Europe. She had written many books protecting the interests of farmers in remote areas. Here was a person with a heart of gold. She felt great admiration and sympathy for Vietnam, a small and impoverished nation standing up in heroic valor against the United States, a colossal and imperialistic country. She viewed Vietnam as the symbol for ethical choices and as the heart of humanity. Perhaps there are no words more beautiful than Sarah Lidman's to describe Vietnam. Sarah Lidman visited Vietnam in the midst of the war and became even more admiring and sympathetic when she saw the women and children living under the Americans' cruel bombs. Yet she also saw that these people remained calm and optimistic about the struggle, for they believed we would be victorious in the end. Sarah Lidman was also attentive to the relationship between people within our families and our society. Older sister Bin, she said, Vietnam has a culture that is endlessly precious. People live together with feeling and meaning in a beautiful way. In Europe, they become uncivilized and know only about living to please ourselves. We bent on winning for ourselves at any cost. These days, in truth, the words of this dear Swedish friend are worth a great deal of thought. Indeed, during those years of war, we Vietnamese truly did live in a society which was good and strong. I believe that we Vietnamese today can draw from our wartime society a deep source of strength, which we must always preserve. In truth, the return of peace brings difficulties greater than in war. I know many close friends have worried about us with respect to this very point. Sarah Lidman was among them. She was not a communist, and she did not speak about class struggle or socialism. She had a soul, which was clear and noble, and so she placed a high value on equality and compassion while hating injustice, oppression, and exploitation. When I would share confidences with her about the weaknesses that remained in our society, she would always find a way to defend us and cover this up. Sarah passed away several years ago in her home village, a tranquil rural area in the south of Sweden. She was a marvelous friend, whom we can never forget. I also often think of Algeria, a place where people would refer to Vietnam as their older brother and older sister. Vietnam and Algeria were close through a special, shared history. In 1954, we had just finished our war of resistance against France with the glorious victory in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu when the Algerians began their military struggle, which lasted until 1962. Only then, after the Evian Agreement, did Algeria secure independence and freedom from the French colonialists. Algerians regarded Vietnam with gratitude and felt the Vietnamese people had opened the way for Algeria, struggle as well as for the worldwide national independence movement. Starting from this special relationship, the Algerian government, the Algerian FNL, Front for National Liberation, Party, and the Algerian people continuously supported Vietnam when we were forced to fight the United States. Paris and Algiers are not far apart. We had many chances to travel to Algiers and discuss with our friends the situation of the struggle inside our country and the negotiations in Paris. President Boumediene and Foreign Minister Bouteflika considered me a close friend and reserved for me in Algiers a private villa, which our friends called me Bin's villa. At the time, Algeria played an important role in the non-aligned movement, NAM, and was central in helping the NLFPRG take part. Their help came at the time when the countries in NAM that had a strong relationship with the United States and the Saigon administration looked for ways to hamper us. In the middle of 1970, I went to visit Yugoslavia. As soon as I set foot there, I remembered the books I had read during the beginning of my efforts to oppose French colonialism. Those texts described the anti-fascist war and Yugoslavia's guerrilla movement, in which President Tito was the iconic image and for which he was subsequently honored as a national hero. After World War II, Yugoslavia backed the Bandung spirit and joined the non-aligned movement. Later, splits in the labor movement and in international communism made it difficult for Yugoslavia. As a result, the country's international importance declined. Nevertheless, President Tito and the Yugoslav government were consistent in their warm support for the Vietnamese people's struggle during our two wars of resistance. After we had signed the Paris Agreement, I visited Yugoslavia once again along with PRG President Nguyen Thi Binh. President Tito personally drove the car and took us to visit Bruni Island in the Adriatic, where the blue of the sea has a special hue. In the middle of 1970, the battlefield forces between the enemy and us were relatively even. When the negotiations in Paris stalled, I took advantage of the hiatus to visit other countries and attend international conferences. Comrade Din Ba Thi, deputy head of our delegation, replaced me every Thursday at the Kleber Conference Center. In July, we paid an official visit to India at the invitation of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and then travelled on to Sri Lanka at the invitation of Prime Minister Bandaranaike. At this time, Delhi had two Vietnamese consulates, one for the DRVN and one for the Saigon administration. The Saigon consul objected when he heard about our delegation's arrival. He left India for home. His action was a defeat for the Saigon administration because I had come through an official invitation from the Indian government. The Indian government replied to his objection, saying, "Whomever we invite is our right." Indian political circles were divided. Traveling along the road, we could see two kinds of signs: "Welcome me, Bin," and "Me, Bin, go home." When journalists asked my impressions, I said, "The Indian people support us, for which we are very thankful." After this visit, we returned home. India was very hot in July, but wherever we went, people poured out onto the streets, particularly in Calcutta, now Kolkata. Many people approached us to grasp our hands, while others kissed the hems of my ao dai. At the time, the Indians had a famous slogan, "You are Vietnam. I am Vietnam. We are Vietnam." Many people supported us, but some did not. In quite a few places, Indians argued with each other about red flags or black flags. We were pleased that there were always more red flags. This visit was the first time I met Indira Gandhi, about whom I had heard so much praise. She was the daughter of Elder Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, a huge country, which had achieved independence after nearly 100 years of imperialist British domination. Indira Gandhi had taken the name of her husband, Feroz Gandhi, also a politician and a famous journalist. When Indira Gandhi was young, she accompanied her father, who conscientiously trained her to become a high-level politician. She was proud to be a niece of Uncle Ho. I had a deep and positive impression of Indira Gandhi not only because of her dignified, serious appearance and her noble bearing but also from her political acumen. During that visit to India, I came to understand more about one of the oldest and greatest cultures in Asia. At the same time, I was deeply impressed by the warm feelings of the Indian people toward Uncle Ho and Vietnam. My visit to India created a positive effect on Indian public opinion, with the result that, subsequently, the Indian government made an important decision, which enhanced our prestige. Previously, India and Poland had been two of the countries on the International Commission for Supervision and Control of the Implementation of the 1954 Geneva Agreements on Vietnam and Laos. To maintain neutrality, India had established a general consulate in Hanoi and another in Saigon. Then in the beginning of 1972, India established formal diplomatic relations with the DRVN and opened an embassy in Hanoi. On September 17, 1970, we at the Paris negotiations began another diplomatic offensive. With the PRG's 8 points, we demanded that the United States withdraw all its troops before June 30, 1971, set aside the Thu Ky Kim administration, and establish a provisional coalition government in the South. The 8 points created reverberations, which resounded throughout the urban areas of the South. Those points received worldwide acclaim as part of a flexible and reasonable proposal. In addition to my responsibilities as foreign minister and delegation head at the Paris conference, I had an assignment as traveling diplomatic representative for the PRG state. My task was to encourage other governments to establish official diplomatic relations with the PRG. By 1970, 24 governments had diplomatic relations with the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Our official participation in the non-aligned movement became a major goal for expanding the PRG's international position. At that time, the non-aligned movement included more than 100 Third World member nations from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. NAM's guidelines were to struggle for independence and non-alignment, that is, not to follow the side of socialism but also not to follow the side of Western capitalism. The NLF-PRG platform with its position regarding peaceful foreign affairs and neutrality conformed appropriately to NAM's guiding principles. Although we had many friends in NAM, admission was not easy. In September 1970, I received directions along with comrades Ngoc Dung, Bin Tan, Lee Van Sao, and Lamai to go to Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, to lobby in this important campaign. We arrived in Tanzania and expected to travel from there to Zambia, but we couldn't find any way to fly to Zambia from Tanzania's largest city, Dar es Salaam. The date for the meeting of NAM heads of state was imminent. It was all very confusing. We were fortunate to meet older sister Maria, the private secretary of Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, a major African politician, who was sympathetic to Vietnam's struggle. Older sister Maria suggested we ask if we could travel on the president's special airplane. I went to see the president and presented our problem. He was delighted to receive our request, and so, the 5 of us boarded the president's special plane. We were even more delighted that Ugandan President Obo traveled with us. While on the airplane, I sat between the 2 presidents. The trip gave us time to talk. When our delegation landed at the airport, the Zambians greeted me formally as if I were a head of state. The foreign ministers met first. The meeting of heads of state would follow. At the foreign ministers' meeting, comrades from Cuba and Algeria suggested admitting the PRG. Hectic activity ensued. Some African countries maintained close relations with the United States and the Saigon administration. They objected, while other countries had no position. In the end, the meeting decided that, as a first step, the PRG could have observer status. This was an important victory. From that point forward, the PRG's diplomatic status changed. I was invited to speak at the meeting of heads of state. Everyone was attentive. The next day, I went to give my greetings to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and to President Nyerere to thank them for the support of India and Tanzania. Many heads of state wanted to meet the Madam Foreign Minister of the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. Notable among them was President Bokassa of the Central African Republic. He had served as a French legionnaire in Vietnam. The head of state for Ethiopia, Emperor Haile Selassie, was elegantly dressed as would befit a royal personage. He moved forward in the midst of a large and obsequious entourage of junior officials. The appearance of a woman as the foreign minister from a struggling country, which was the center of world attention, caused the emperor and his delegation to take notice and even to show some sympathy. During subsequent years, I always received support from Asian and African delegations at international conferences. I worked in close coordination with them, especially on matters related to Vietnam, anti-imperialism, and opposition to wars of aggression. Many foreign ministers whom I knew during those years later became heads of state, for example, in Algeria, Madagascar, and Mali. These leaders retained good feelings toward Vietnam and toward me personally. In October 1970, I visited Bulgaria, the country of roses. Bulgaria is a prosperous agricultural country, which produces flowers and fruits said to be the best in Europe. Comrade Todor Zhivkov, the General Secretary of the Bulgarian Communist Party, welcomed me with great enthusiasm. During a consultative meeting with the Bulgarian Foreign Minister, we received news of the death of former French President Charles de Gaulle. I returned to Paris in order to represent the PRG at President de Gaulle's state funeral. This was a very solemn affair with many heads of state delegations from all continents. After the funeral, I returned to Bulgaria. In early 1971, I visited Cuba. Comrade Fidel Castro called that year the Year of Solidarity with Vietnam. My visit opened with a huge rally in José Martí Square. I had the feeling that all of Havana was present. There, Comrade Fidel promulgated his famous, fiery slogan, "Cuba is ready to dedicate all her blood for Vietnam." The atmosphere was intensely emotional, with everyone shouting, "Vietnam, Cuba," and "Americans out of Vietnam." Later, the Vietnamese embassy reported that it had received thousands of letters from Cuban citizens volunteering to fight alongside their comrades in Vietnam. Solidarity with Vietnam penetrated every family and every Cuban, from senior citizens to children. The children of Comrade Raúl Castro and Vilma Easpen were young, about 11 or 12 years old. The older son came with his mother to visit me. He was startled to see my long hair. He asked, "May I go to Vietnam and fight?" I was so touched. "Aaron, you afraid of dying?" I asked. "If I die," he answered with pride, "I'll be a martyr." In 1972, the foreign ministers from countries in the non-aligned movement met in Georgetown, Guyana. Comrade Hoang Bich Sun, the PRG deputy foreign minister, led our delegation to lobby for the PRG's full membership in the non-aligned movement. The delegation's efforts were such that a majority of nations approved our application at the conference the following year. In June 1973, at the meeting of heads of state in Algeria, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam was recognized as an official member of the non-aligned movement. It would be a major oversight if I did not mention my visits to the Soviet Union and China during the years of the Paris Conference. I cannot remember how many official visits I made to the Soviet Union, China, and most of the socialist countries of Eastern Europe. The governments and the people there consistently expressed tremendous goodwill toward Vietnam. The assistance from the Soviet and Chinese peoples during our struggle was enormous. I attended rallies held by the Communist Party, the state, and the people of China at Beijing's Great Hall with tens of thousands in attendance, and I joined solemn meetings with Soviet leaders at the Grand Kremlin Palace. Every time we returned from France to Vietnam, we stopped off in Moscow and Beijing. We felt safe and welcomed there, as if we were at home. In those years, the empathy between us was deep and sincere. In 1971, the situation on the battlefield became very tense. The mental battle at the conference table was also tense. By late 1971 and early 1972, the balance of forces was precarious. The Paris conference continued, but as the journalists wrote, our discussions were like verbal jousts between deaf people. Perhaps I can say that this was the worst time for us. At times, we became especially homesick. I read and reread my daughter Mai's squiggly lines. By then, she was 11 years old. She wasn't even 8 when I left for Paris. She wrote, "When will you return to us children?" My husband was still teaching at the Army Engineering School, but his health had begun to decline. This added to my worries and left me feeling helpless because I could not be nearby to care for him. That was my personal mood. I knew that each person in our delegation had his or her own personal challenges, anxieties, and mood swings. However, through all this, we always held on to this special point. We never thought Vietnam could be defeated. We were determined to achieve victory. The only question was, when? In February 1971, the United States launched an offensive on Route 9 in southern Laos to cut off the north-south supply route, thereby hoping to isolate and encircle our liberation army. The Americans' efforts ended in miserable failure. From Paris, we sent our reports to Stockholm, Rome, Montreal, and New York. We described clearly the U.S. expansion of aggression into Laos. The news spread immediately from those sites to other countries. At meetings and demonstrations, countless participants condemned the United States and demanded that the United States stop escalating the war. During those days, our two delegations from the North and the South were terribly busy. We quickly implemented what we called our diplomacy coordinated with the battlefield. More than a month later, the American and puppet troops were forced to withdraw from southern Laos after they had suffered huge military and political losses. Our position was visibly strengthened. On reflection, I think perhaps it can be said that the warriors in Paris at that time also contributed their small and indirect part to the victory in Laos that year. On July 1, 1971, the PRG delegation announced its 7-point program. The points included withdrawal of all U.S. troops in concert with the release of political prisoners and the Saigon administration's acceptance of a new administration ready to discuss with the PRG the establishment of a national reconciliation government. In this way, we separated the contentious aspects of U.S. withdrawal from the political issues involving the South. Here was another wise step. Diplomacy can work that way. Flexibility can be an offensive. This initiative had a huge effect by generating positive world opinion and support from many governments. Washington searched for other schemes. Kissinger and then Nixon visited Beijing. They wanted to make everyone think the major powers would resolve the war among themselves. They hoped to drive a wedge between the USSR and China. Foreign media covered in detail the secret meetings in Shanghai between the United States and China as well as China's public statement to the effect of, "If you don't touch us, then we won't touch you." I believe history will remember this unusual secret meeting. Yet nothing could deter our people in Vietnam's two sectors, the North and the South. Indeed, our determination on the military, political, and diplomatic fronts grew even stronger. I returned to Hanoi in the middle of 1971, when we had large floods in the north. The army and the people struggled to combat the new U.S. air war and to protect the Red River dikes. The army had to destroy some embankments protecting Hanoi's Gia Lam district in order to keep the center of Hanoi from flooding. In March 1972, our army and people began a large offensive in three important directions: the eastern sector of the South, the Central Highlands, and Quang Tri, Thu Thien provinces in the northern part of South Vietnam. The Quang Tri campaign, which lasted until September 1972, was among the war's fiercest battles. By early 1972, I was back in Paris and continued attending the meetings at Kleber Conference Center every Thursday morning. At this time, as before, the battlefield was tense, while the conference table was also tense. Our feelings of discontent continued. We did not know when we would overcome the deadlock. Nevertheless, we continued publicizing the deceptions and endless cruelties of the U.S. Thu administration. We continued to demand that the United States completely withdraw its troops. On January 11, 1972, I received a directive to announce our 2 points: withdraw American troops and form in the South a national government of concord drawn from three sectors: the PRG, the Saigon administration, and the Third Force. By this time, our army was launching a counter-offensive on the battlefield, while the United States was in a presidential election year. The American people were demanding that Nixon bring U.S. troops home. I can say that the PRG's 7-point plan, along with the 2 additional points including the withdrawal of U.S. troops so that the Vietnamese in the South could solve their own internal issues, were both insightful and timely as strategic policies. World public opinion, and particularly U.S. public opinion, supported this view, whereas our new initiative seemed to disconcert the Saigon administration. Internal conflict among the Saigon authorities increased, as did the citizens' hatred for them. To deceive the American public before the election, the Nixon administration arranged a so-called political solution for the war in Vietnam. The United States agreed with the DRVN to enter into secret talks. In Paris, the historic Battle of Wits between Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger began. It could be said that this was the decisive season on 2 fronts: military and diplomatic. Simultaneously, the American Air Force intended to bomb the Red River dikes during the rainy season's peak. At that time, the DRVN delegation spoke out at the Paris conference against the Americans' cruel scheme. We had invited many international delegations to visit and examine the sites. During that time, Jane Fonda visited the PRG delegation in Paris and shared a meal with me before leaving for Vietnam. Ramsey Clark traveled with Jane Fonda to Hanoi. He had resigned his cabinet position as President Johnson's Attorney General in 1969 in protest against the U.S. war policy. After returning to the United States from visiting Vietnam in 1972, both Jane Fonda and Ramsey Clark spoke with the authority of those who could say, "Our eyes have seen, our ears have heard." They said clearly that the dikes protecting the Red River Delta were not military emplacements, as the U.S. government had deceptively said in the public media. Mr. Raymond Aubrac, a close friend of ours in France, encouraged the Vatican and the United Nations to speak out and stop the vicious U.S. plan to bomb our protective dikes. The war in our country reached a high point of intensity both in the north and in the south. The United States bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail 24 hours a day. The USA mined ports in the north and blocked our shipping lanes. In Paris, we followed the news from Quang Tri hour by hour, particularly the battle for the famous Quang Tri citadel. We did not receive specific and timely news, but whatever was announced made our hearts pound. We knew our warriors were very young, yet we also knew our troops understood that taking the land At that sight created the essential image of taking back freedom and independence for our homeland. For that, our soldiers were willing to sacrifice their lives. After 81 destructive days and nights, our troops could no longer hold the Quang Tri citadel, but our troops' combat spirit showed Vietnam's unwavering determination. We in Paris understood that this spirit was an important contribution to our struggle at the conference table. During those days, many American groups' mothers, wives of pilots, religious leaders, women, and young activists visited our two delegations. I remember in particular Martin Fenrider, the leader of a group with 24 American youth. He presented me with a poem, which he had just composed. By the end of September 1972, only 2 months remained before the U.S. presidential elections, creating an opportunity for us to pressure the United States into substantive negotiations. Comrade Le Duc Tho, special advisor to the DRVN delegation, brought from home the Paris Draft Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. We announced the contents of the draft agreement, which the Politburo in Hanoi had carefully examined. From the beginning of negotiations until September 1972, Vietnam's stance had consistently stressed that any whole package solution must fulfill two basic requirements: complete and unconditional withdrawal of all U.S. troops from the South and the removal of the Saigon administration set up by the United States. These two requirements were interlinked. However, the draft agreement emphasized only the requirement for complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from the South but relaxed our demands about political issues in the South. After examining the draft agreement, some comrades in the PRG delegation raised questions. If the political issues were left to the South, would we be able to achieve complete liberation? Could we end the war? Experience in Laos after the 1962 Geneva Agreement had shown that a multi-sided coalition government led to civil war. Would that same dynamic play out in Vietnam? What would happen to the tens of thousands of our brothers and sisters who were political prisoners? Could we guarantee their safe release? What would be the appearance and situation in the South after the American troops left? We spent several days in discussions. Yet ultimately we all agreed that total American withdrawal from the South was the crucial issue. For more than 2 months, DRVN advisor Le Duc Tho and Minister Xuan Thuy engaged in fiery debates with Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's national security advisor, regarding the draft Paris Agreement. At that time, international public opinion, especially in Paris, described National Security Advisor Kissinger as a wise diplomat with experience in political negotiations. People often ask if I ever met with Kissinger. The truth is that I met him many times but only indirectly. During the debate between the two special advisors, Kissinger and Le Duc Tho, in reference to the PRG's positions, Kissinger and I spoke directly with each other only once, after the Paris Agreement had been signed. We lifted our champagne glasses and toasted each other, celebrating peace. By early October 1972, the two sides, the DRVN and the United States, had agreed on a basic draft. They set October 30th as the date for signing the Paris Peace Agreement on ending the war. Our two delegations were frantically busy during those days. Our delegation from the South increased its external relations and press releases in order to clarify our position and foil the enemy's die-hard efforts to prolong the war. Representatives from many countries were anxious to know the outcome of the secret talks. We were both excited and worried. As anticipated, in early November 1972, Nixon won the election. In successive, deceitful moves, he demanded changes to the agreement's content. In an effort to force Vietnam to accept his changes, Nixon instigated vicious bombing of Hanoi and Hai Phong for 12 days and nights, from December 18 until December 29, 1972. We were terribly worried when we heard the Americans were using B-52 strategic bombers in raids against our capital and our major cities. The B-52s were the Americans' most modern carpet bombers. They flew at a height of 10 kilometers and in the company of a phalanx of fighter jets. Their radar jamming equipment made them difficult to detect and, therefore, made it harder for our missiles to hit their targets. Our friends in France and other countries all worried about us. They wondered, this time, could we resist? This was the Americans' most decisive and treacherous thrashing. On December 21, in protest, we announced cessation of the negotiations. Those were incredibly stressful days. We followed the situation at home very closely. We heard that our troops had shot down a B-52 at Haiphong, and then we heard they had shot one down at Hanoi, and then the list continued. Our soldiers shot down 1, 2, 3, and more B-52s. We were beside ourselves with joy. We were convinced our courageous army and people would defeat the enemy's savage bombardment. In addition to our general anxiety, all of us in the delegation, particularly the women, followed the Americans' assault ever so closely to know the sites where the enemy poured its B-52 bombs. Did the bombs hit our loved ones? Were our children still alive? I was beside myself with anxiety when I heard the Americans had bombed Hung Yen, a provincial capital about 30 kilometers from Hanoi. Had my children survived? I was so fortunate. Several days later, comrades inside the country informed me that my children were safe. I breathed a deep sigh of relief. When I first left Hanoi for Paris to take part in the negotiations, my daughter was 8 years old, while my son was 11. I missed them so much. Every now and then, someone would arrive from home, and I would receive letters from Kang and our children. Every one of the letters from my daughter, would ask, "Mother, when are you coming home?" So many families were separated during the 9 years of evacuation of Vietnam's cities to avoid losses to civilians from U.S. bombs. The deepest wish of Vietnamese children during that time was to live with their fathers and mothers. I was called home on urgent business. En route, arriving in China, I met Chairman Mao Zedong and a number of other Chinese leaders. Chairman Mao said, "Why do you Vietnamese comrades react so strongly? At some point, the Americans will leave." Since I did not quite understand Chairman Mao's point, I made no comment. In the middle of the night of December 30, I arrived in Hanoi and heard the news that the United States had stopped the bombing. The Americans were bitter when they saw that even all their B-52s could not dampen our people's will. The bombing was a U.S. military defeat with heavy losses of B-52 airplanes, but the political disaster for the United States was even greater. The whole world condemned the United States. Even the British government, the closest U.S. ally in Europe, issued a statement about British regret. In the face of this U.S. action, years later, I learned that in the 1960s President Ho Chi Minh had said, "Experience from the Korean War teaches us that the United States will eventually use their B-52s to threaten us." From that point, our military under the direction of the Ministry of Defense, began to research ways to shoot down B-52s. Indeed, Uncle Ho was forward-looking, and our army was truly courageous and smart. On January 21, 1973, I returned to Paris, where the weather was brisk, sunny, and beautiful. On January 23, 1973, Comrade Le Duc Tho and Henry Kissinger initialed the text of the agreement. And then, several days later, on January 27, we 4 foreign ministers signed the Paris Agreement. The Americans' initial demands, both sides would withdraw their troops. That is, American troops and troops from the North would withdraw in what the Americans called reciprocity, met defeat. The United States was forced to sign a peace agreement with the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam. It was clear that the United States had no other alternative. We had achieved a momentous victory. The United States had to withdraw completely, while Vietnamese troops remained on Vietnamese land. I had a deep feeling of ferocity alongside an equally deep feeling of serenity, for I assumed that whatever must occur would occur. The day of the Paris Agreement signing, January 27, 1973, holds great historic significance for our nation. Each member of our delegation can never forget that day. All the world's newspapers placed this major event on their first pages. Across the world, people who loved peace and justice were in a festive mood as if they were the victors. On the night of January 26, no one in our two delegations could sleep. We were all preparing for the work we would do the next day. On the morning of January 27, 1973, the Kleber conference room was bright with lights. Outside, thousands of people, our overseas Vietnamese compatriots, French friends, and friends from other countries, stood waiting amidst a forest of flags. I felt apprehensive as I walked into the conference room. At exactly 10:00, 4 foreign ministers sat down at the table. We were the foreign ministers of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Nguyen Thi Binh, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam, Nguyen Thi Binh, the United States of America, William P. Rogers, and the Republic of Vietnam, Tran Van Lam. Each of us signed the 32 documents in the Paris Agreement. I felt deeply moved as I added my signature to the historic agreement. It was as if I represented the Southern revolutionary people and warriors who had accepted responsibility for struggling on the front lines and in the prisons to raise our flag in dazzling victory. I felt immeasurably honored. I do not have enough words to describe the endless gratitude I was feeling for our compatriots and our warriors from north to south. They had endured every courageous sacrifice in the struggle so that we could achieve victory that day. I was remembering Uncle Ho and feeling thankful to comrades from the party leadership, from the National Liberation Front, and from the Provisional Revolutionary Government. They had believed they could count on me for this difficult and honorable responsibility. I was feeling particularly grateful to our Vietnamese cousins in France and neighboring countries, as well as to our international friends, who gave their full hearts to our struggle. I was feeling indebted to the brothers and sisters in both our negotiating delegations and to our office and support personnel in Paris. And, yes, as I signed those 32 documents, I was thinking about my family, about my husband and my children. In truth, things did not flow perfectly after we signed the agreement. The United States still refused to accept defeat. As soon as the American Secretary of State affixed his signature, the United States embarked on its next scheme. We knew and expected this. Nevertheless, for us, the signed Paris Agreement was a great victory, a decisive step toward the ultimate victory that would return to us our reunited nation. The agreement reinforced and enhanced the PRG's prestige among other nations in the international community. A month later, on March 2, 1973, an international conference held at Kleber International Conference Center affirmed the legality of the Paris Agreement on Vietnam. The DRVN and American delegations organizing the international conference had argued about the venue. Should the conference be in Paris, New York, or Geneva? Who would attend? What would be the conference formalities? Some of those meetings ran until the wee hours of the morning. In the end, the two sides reached this consensus. The International Conference on Vietnam would have 12 participating government delegations led by their foreign ministers, with UN Secretary-General Kurt Waldheim as an invited guest. Among the 12 delegations, our side invited representatives of Hungary and Poland, while the United States invited Canada and Indonesia. The two sides, the United States and the DRVN, jointly invited China, France, the USSR, and the United Kingdom. A few days before the international conference, I received news that Mr. Kurt Waldheim, on his own initiative, was traveling to Paris to meet the DRVN and PRG delegations. He wanted to have an important role as an individual both at the International Conference on Vietnam and subsequently. Our comrades in the DRVN delegation let it be known that this issue was a decision for the PRG delegation. And so, Mr. Waldheim came to meet me at our delegation's headquarters in Verrières-le-Buisson. During our discussion, Mr. Waldheim told me that the United Nations recognized the reality in Vietnam of three governments: the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of Vietnam. He suggested that, afterwards, the DRVN and the PRG could perhaps request observer status like that of the Saigon administration at the United Nations. He wanted to know if the United Nations could perhaps assist Vietnam in rebuilding the country. We knew the Secretary-General of the United Nations had sided with the United States during the American War in Vietnam. Surely, his intentions were not simple. Given that context, we could not possibly accept the United Nations as a member of the International Conference on Vietnam or agree to allow the UN Secretary-General to serve as the meeting's chairperson. Yet to reassure the United Nations, our two delegations agreed to invite Mr. Waldheim as a special guest at the conference. When I spoke at the International Conference on Vietnam, I thanked the French government for hosting the four-party conference on Vietnam and, now, for hosting the International Conference on Vietnam. With that, I challenged the American puppet regime for not seriously implementing the ceasefire we had signed a month before and for pushing its forces to occupy our liberated areas. At that time, we had a great deal of information about the Saigon Army's plan to flood territory. Many delegations spoke in agreement. There was one short discussion about a suggestion from the Saigon administration's representative to include his speech as an official conference document, but everyone cast that idea aside. In the end, the 12 foreign ministers were unanimous in their agreement to sign the Act on the International Conference on Vietnam, which provided international affirmation of the Paris Agreement. A month before, immediately after signing the Paris Agreement, our PRG delegation sent Comrade Dang Van Tu and Comrade Le Mai to Saigon to join the PRG military delegation in the bilateral and quadrilateral joint military commissions at Tan Son Nhut Airport. This step was in direct accordance with the roadmap for implementing the agreement's military provisions. A week after signing the Paris Agreement, we joined the Paris Overseas Vietnamese community in greeting Tet, the Year of the Water Buffalo, for our delegation's fifth and last Tet in France. It is impossible to describe everyone's joy and pleasure. Immediately after the International Conference on Vietnam, in accordance with Article 12 of the Paris Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam, the two sides from the South agreed to meet to discuss and sign an agreement on the internal affairs of the South. Tran Van Lam, Foreign Minister of the Saigon administration, and I met to prepare for that consultative conference between the two sides. The first bilateral consultative meeting opened on March 19, 1974 at Le Celle St. Cloud Palace southwest of Paris. Professor and Minister Nguyen Van Hue led the PRG delegation, while Deputy Prime Minister Nguyen Lu Vien led the Saigon administration's delegation. Those bilateral talks lasted until their dissolution in April 1974. At the same time, a fierce war continued between the Liberation Armed Forces and the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN. Bombs continued their death blows. Blood continued to flow. Initially, the enemy occupied quite a few of our liberated areas, but after a while, we were able to counterattack. We had anticipated the enemy's offensive strategy in Region 9. We retained our battlefield position and fought with valor. When I returned home from Paris and went to visit a number of localities and units, the comrades in the South would tease me. "You comrades signed the peace agreement. We delighted with the shreds." During those years in Paris, in addition to other tasks, we in particular, Sister Nguyen Thi Chan and Brother Phan Nhan, received directives to mobilize the overseas Vietnamese in surrounding countries and the people who had come from the South to visit France. Brothers and sisters belonging to organizations of patriotic overseas Vietnamese in Germany, Canada, Belgium, Italy, etc., met with the DRVN and PRG delegations to secure reports on the situation in their homeland and to help mobilize their friends. We placed great importance on this work. These days, now and then in my free time, I read my notebooks from that period, when I kept brief notes on the activities of the NLF-PRG negotiating delegation in Paris. Unfortunately, I cannot decipher some words written in my own shorthand and other words written in haste. Still, I am amazed at the enormous volume of work we accomplished during those years. Our delegation held regular meetings with comrades Le Duc Tho and Xuan Thuy, when we would hear briefings about the military and political situation at home as well as appraisals of the world situation. We would also hear new directives from our leaders at home. We were always having discussions between our two delegations about the direction of our specific struggle and the content of the presentations we would make at the negotiating table. We would try to predict our opponents' responses and formulate our responses in turn. Of course, we heard reports on our opponents' moves and accounts of public opinion in the media, particularly in the American and Western press. Then we would divide the tasks for joining various activities of solidarity with Vietnam in the wider community. We would attend international conferences, visit other countries, meet with foreign delegations, host Vietnamese overseas, plan our interviews with journalists from newspapers and television, and keep supportive international organizations informed. Looking back, I find it extraordinary how such a small group of highly motivated people working closely together managed to accomplish all these assigned tasks. I increasingly understand the importance of diplomatic action. Perhaps a wise diplomatic policy had assisted and expanded the battlefield's victories in a way that was most advantageous to our country. I left Paris and returned home in early April 1973. The farewell gathering at Le Bourget Airport, the same airport where I had landed more than 4 years before, was an emotional occasion. Overseas Vietnamese, French friends, the French press, and representatives of countries with which we had close relationships arrived in great numbers. The UFF French women embraced me with emotion. "Bin, we miss you," they said. "From now on, we want to be able to see you standing there every Thursday in front of the journalists at the Kleber International Conference Center. We want to be able to call out, me. Bin, smile." Surely these friends also knew that I would miss France and my dear friends. I would miss so many people, in particular the French comrades Pierre, Toto, Alain, and others who were our French security guards and drivers. The French Communist Party had assigned them to care for our delegation through all those years of negotiations. I would miss the overseas Vietnamese who did not spare their efforts and precious time to improve our situation, people like Uncle Tai, Uncle Kai, Sister Hoang An, and Dr. Phan. The list could go on and on. On my way home, I stopped off in Moscow, where 3 of the Soviet Union's highest-placed comrades Podgorny, Suslov, and Brezhnev hosted me with great warmth. They conferred on me their Peace Medal, the Soviet Union's noblest accolade. Then I stopped over in China, where I was also received with great consideration. Prime Minister Zhou Enlai and other Chinese comrades convened a congratulatory banquet. At last, our delegation's greatest happiness was to return home to our compatriots and comrades. Comrades Le Duan, Pham Van Dong, and others congratulated us on the successful completion of our mission. Finally, I could return to my smallest and most intimate group. Once again, I could be with my husband and children amid feelings of indescribable joy. 7. Total victory. The war raged on, even though the four parties had signed the Paris Peace Agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. The National Liberation Front, NLF, of South Vietnam continued its work but in a different way. I returned to Hanoi to continue my assignment as the PRG's foreign minister. Throughout the war, the South was the primary battlefield, while the North was a huge rearguard. Some years before, Hanoi had established CP-72 to manage and expand the foreign relations front for the NLF, and particularly to do this after we had established the Provisional Revolutionary Government (PRG) of the Republic of South Vietnam. By the time I returned to Hanoi, the CP-72 office had 10 units with more than 200 officials and support staff. I was appointed to serve as the party general secretary for the staff. We had 3 comrades as the deputy foreign ministers: Hoang Bich Sun, Vo Dong Jiang, and Le Quang Chan. These capable and efficient colleagues were also dear friends. The National Liberation Front was located at COSVN, Central Office in South Vietnam, our official headquarters at Loc Ninh. However, we continued to do the major part of our diplomatic work in the liberated area of Quang Tri Province at Cam Lo, which is 10 kilometers north of the Hien Luong Bridge over the Ben Hai River, the center of the former demilitarized zone dividing North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Thus, the headquarters of the PRG Foreign Ministry was only 10 kilometers as the birds fly from the enemy's military outposts. Were it not for the occasional, reverberating gunfire, no one would know that we were right there alongside the enemy. Our military brothers would remind us that we had nothing to fear. They pointed out that, since we were within the enemy's artillery range, the enemy was also within our range. We built our Ministry of Foreign Affairs on a 2-hectare piece of land. The building, which had been fashioned from painted plywood, had 3 rooms in the layout of a traditional Vietnamese house in the countryside. We used the middle room, the largest, for meeting visitors and receiving the diplomatic credentials of official guests. To the left of the ministry building was our hotel, where we had housing for guests. President of the PRG Government Advisory Council, Nguyen Hu Tho, held official meetings at our foreign ministry in Cam Lo. He met representatives of the governments that came to present their credentials as well as other important delegations, among them a delegation led by Comrade Fidel Castro and another led by Georges Marchais, General Secretary of the French Communist Party. My colleagues and I in CP-72 were very busy with diplomatic work. Depending on the situation, we would issue statements exposing the American schemes designed to help the Saigon administration violate the Paris Agreement. We would use either the name of the National Liberation Front or the Provisional Revolutionary Government when we described the cruel effect of these schemes on our people. In addition, we sent delegations from our mass organizations to take part in international conferences, where we could mobilize other countries to support the Vietnamese people and demand that the United States strictly follow the Paris Agreement. We organized large receptions with performance troops on anniversaries, in particular on December 20, the founding of the NLF, and on June 6, the founding of the PRG. Our goal was to see that all who visited the liberated area of Quang Tri Province received a good impression of our country and people. Even though our officials and the local people were very poor, they were rich in personal warmth and delighted in hosting guests. My primary work was mobilizing other governments to grant the PRG formal diplomatic recognition. Before the Paris Agreement, the NLF-PRG had established diplomatic relations with many governments. By the end of 1973, 32 countries had formal diplomatic relations with the PRG.